afterwards? No, we all good? We all happy? Lovely. Okay, so I will start. I will start with the slides just to kind of give you guys a quick little overview of what we're doing. So we're doing Charlotte Turner Smith today. She is really one of the founding voices of Romanticism. She didn't create Romanticism. No one person created Romanticism, but she's one of the very, very earliest Romantics and has a huge influence on all the other big guys that we're going to be looking at, particularly Wordsworth. I think I mentioned this before. She is a distant cousin of Wordsworth, but they didn't know each other outside of publication. So he read her stuff and was, wow, this person's awesome. So she was a huge, huge influence at the time and incredibly famous. She's famous for her sonnets, which is kind of the follow-up reading, the further reading for this piece, for this class, sorry. These were what really kind of broke into the public consciousness. People read these sonnets and they went, wow. And the thing that was really revolutionary about these sonnets was that they were in this first person voice. They were very emotive. They were talking a lot about nature. But it was really this notion of writing poetry that was personal and that it was just about individual emotions. That was really quite revolutionary at this stage. But feel free, guys, to jump in at any point. I can't see all of you, so if you've got your hand raised or anything, I wouldn't necessarily see that. So just pop yourself off mute if you have any question at any point. Free to interrupt me. So the Elegiac Sonnets are her first kind of big, impressive piece. The Emigrants is the one that we're going to be looking at today, which is a little bit later, but is absolutely incredible, like really, really amazing, I think. How have we gotten on with the Emigrants, by the way? Have we all managed to read that?
Some of it, but not all of it. I didn't get around to.
That's okay. That's great. It's good to know where we're kind of at. Everyone else, a little bit. No, not so much, but some. Yes, cool. What I'm going to propose that we do today, I'll do my little introductory stuff, just summarizing some of the main themes, main ideas of who she is. I want to basically annotate the Emigrants with you guys, to go through all of book one and make that our main focus. We'll have a shorter session today because you've already got the video online, so you can kind of go back to that if you haven't seen that afterwards. But I want to go through the Emigrants in a lot of detail, kind of bearing in mind that part of your assessment is going to be annotating a poem. So we'll just go through it bit by bit and say, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? I think because it is a long poem, it has that sort of structure that it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but actually it's sort of, once you've broken it into the sections of, oh, now she's talking about this, now she's talking about this, it's really quite accessible, I think, and very, very rewarding reading. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Regis and Canon, I think I talked about that a lot last week, and we've talked about it in video. Engrams, I will talk about engrams later. Okay, so this is our focus of today. This is Charlotte Smith. She had just an awful life. Like, we really need to engage with that, and I think that's something we can't help encountering as we're reading her works. So the Elegiac Sonnets, it's all about this kind of this sadness, and she never sort of says explicitly in the Elegiac Sonnets what's wrong, what's happening to her, but what you do get is that this is a person who is really very miserable and is having an absolutely terrible time in life, and people were concerned about that. The reviewers and so on were writing these things saying, oh my goodness, what is wrong here? Presumably this is all made up misery just for the effect of poetry, right? The writer doesn't really feel this, which I don't think we would think now. We sort of, if anything, tend to go the other way. now when we're reading poetry, we so often think, well, this is just yourself, this is just the poet talking, and we're often at pains to go, the speaker isn't necessarily the poet, these are two different functions. But for Smith, it's a very personal medium. Yes, there is a kind of a facade, a public persona that she's putting on. She's not saying, and my husband is awful. This is why I'm sad. Here's everything. She's kind of keeping some, I think, almost a kind of modesty. If we think of the kind of the manners of the time, she's keeping some distance. I'm not going to tell you everything about myself. So she is. She's fairly well-to-do when she's born. She's not sort of incredibly rich, but she has a decent. Her family have a decent income. She's sometimes called, so Charlotte Turner is her maiden name. She's sometimes referred to as Charlotte Turner Smith, sometimes just as Charlotte Smith. But her father kind of made some bad choices financially, and ended up sort of marrying her off at either 15 or 16. There's some slight ambiguity about exactly when it is that she gets married. But she is basically just told, okay, we will marry Charlotte to this man, Benjamin Smith. And that's, and Benjamin Smith is fairly respectable as a person. You know, he's a merchant. He's doing fairly well for himself. But it's going to turn out that Benjamin Smith is, one, an exceedingly violent person, and two, spectacularly bad with money, even worse with money than Charlotte's father was. So one, she considered it as being sold into marriage, and this phrase, a legal prostitute, is one that she herself uses much later in life. But she looks back on her marriage and says, I was sold a legal prostitute, because at the time when a young woman is married, her parents give a dowry. They give an amount of money to say, yes, here, this is contributing towards the young couple's life, sort of helping set them up. And so she was kind of saw it as that her husband basically took her for the for the money, essentially, and they have just a genuinely awful life together. There doesn't seem to be any affection between them. They have 12 children overall. I couldn't quite remember when I was doing the video, but I looked it up. It's 12 children, one after the other. And her husband is constantly getting into debt. They have to keep on cutting back, because he's just, one, makes some very bad economical decisions, but two, is seriously involved in gambling. And there comes a point when there is an order out for his arrest, and they literally have to flee the country. And there's some really kind of heartbreaking, particularly letters, but things that were written by her at that time, when she was just going, you know, I have had to leave the country that I love, the home, the people. This is where my family is, and I just had to leave everything behind because of this man that I hate, that I am married to. And then she does something really, really incredible for the time, which is that she leaves him in France. She just takes the children and comes back to England. I can't remember quite how many children she has by the time she's coming back to England. I think she's got about 10 by that point. I think a couple of them have died so far, as children tend to do in these times. But she makes the choice to return to England by herself, and decides to publish her writing to make money, literally, which is an interesting way of thinking about why people write and how they write the things that they do, because there's a financial element. She'd always been a good writer. You know, as a child, she kind of went to various schools and was praised for her artistic ability and her writing ability, musical ability, and particularly because she writes these really beautiful little poems. But she is writing. So she's writing to be published, and I think that always puts an interesting slant on things. She's aware of her readership. She's not a famous personage, She isn't a celebrity in the way that we're going to see people like Byron being celebrities, where the public know all the facts about her life. But her name becomes famous, her works become quite famous. So people don't know the details. The things never become that easy for Charlotte, I'm afraid, and things get more and more complicated as her life goes on. There's a very complicated legal case. Anyone here read Bleak House or know Bleak House, the Charles Dickens novel? There's a very complicated legal case in the heart of that, of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. And a lot of people think this. It's basically just a legal case that's so complicated that there are now several generations on people who just can't, people who are waiting for a verdict and have lost their entire lives and their entire fortunes waiting for the verdict of this complicated chancery case. And that was kind of inspired by what happened with Charlotte Smith. So basically her father-in-law was aware of how absolutely useless and awful his son was. And she seemed to have a good relationship with her father-in-law. So he made a very careful will that was supposed to basically circumvent his son and give all of his money to her and the children. And it was just very badly worded and very complicatedly put together. And she never got the money from it. It just stayed wrapped up in courts for ages and ages. So absolutely, and really, you know, things started to go quite downhill for her in later life. And although she was very famous, she kind of and she was really prolific as well. I think I have on here a slide of all the all the publications that she came up with. By the end of her life, she was really in a great deal of poverty and was struggling. So there's not a great amount of money in writing even back then. But these are so widely read. And I'm doing a Jane Austen module with the third years at the moment, and I was reading a book the other day about that is the influence of Charlotte Smith's novels on Austen. It was sort of something I hadn't read a study like that before, and just going, oh god, yeah, Austen is literally reading all of these, and you can see how she's responding them to them so much. So they're quite gothic. They're not entirely gothic. Some of them are more kind of novels of manners of circumstance, but yeah. So we're not doing any of the novels here. Obviously, we're looking at the poetry, but I think the novels are great fun as well. Desmond has big recommendation should you fancy inquiring in that way. So the elegiac sonnets I've said a lot about in the video, so I shall leave those for just now. And if we have time after we've done the emigrants, we shall come back to look at that. So the emigrants. Let's have a look at this. What I need to do now is actually pause that for a moment and bring up the text. This is so annoying because I can't show you. I mean, hopefully you should all have the book and have your own copy of the text. Charlotte Smith Emigrants. Just need a copy to have in front of us. No, let me make sure it's open. Okay, yes, I think that's gonna do it nicely. So, those of you who've read it, how did you get on with it? What were your kind of initial impressions? Anything you liked, anything you didn't like, anything you've noticed, just in terms of, or any kind of questions? Let's just hear first impressions before we get into the details. A couple of you have said you've started it but not finished it, which says quite a lot, I think, in terms of finding it maybe quite difficult. I mean, for something that is, you know, what, a few pages long. I mean, okay, it's several pages, but we're talking pages rather than tens of pages or hundreds of pages. what happens in this poem? What do we like? Vague impressions.
I did like the feeling of like the displacement she had, like moving somewhere that she didn't really want to be. And I know, like you said in the lecture, like not that she's judging anyone, just that it isn't her culture.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, yes, very much so. And I think her balance in this poem is wonderful. The kind of the level between I'm aware that, you know, you, when she's talking about some of the immigrants, you guys have done some bad things, and she's particularly talking about the French Revolution, and to sort of say, yeah, that's obviously not right, but neither is this. So she's very even, and she's not passionate in that. One thing I will sort of say to clarify is that this is, at this point, she is back in England at this point. So she's been to France, she's had her sort of exiled, her time in exile. She has been to France, and she is now seeing French exiles who've come over to Britain. So she's kind of going, yes, I know how you feel here. What do we know of the French Revolutionary context? I'm sort of aware this is a kind of thing that might be common knowledge and might be kind of vague, fuzzy, and might be, oh yeah, I did this in school, I know everything. Obviously, we'll be going into more depth when we do the pamphlet war stuff. So when we do Burke and Payne and Wollstonecraft and everyone, which is, I think, 2 weeks' time. But our kind of, what is the summary of the French Revolution? What is the one sentence version? Has anyone got sort of vague notions?
Isn't it that they wanted to overthrow the anarchy, and it started like quite popular, but then eventually it got more violent and less popular, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So it kind of starts with the people, the populace, kind of rising up against the monarchy. So the situation in France was essentially that there were very few people at the top who had an awful lot of money, and then an awful lot of people of a lower class who didn't have a lot of money. And unsurprisingly, as people get more educated, as people get a better understanding of these things, which is a time of greater publication, greater literacy, people start to go, I don't think that's fair. And they get cross about that. So yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, yes, it started, in many ways, it started with some very admirable ideas of, well, what would eventually sort of become democracy, of, no, we need to make things more even, we need to distribute things more evenly, and also that the people who rule should be answerable to the people that they're ruling. So, in a kind of a dictatorship, which, a lot of monarchies are, it's just, I'm the king, you do it because I say so. And I think one thing one can absolutely say about France at the time is that there was just no through line between those in power and those below. Like there was no there were no channels of communication. So they were this is the time we have Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette are leaving, and they're living in Versailles, and they have this huge, beautiful palace, and they're wearing these fantastic gowns, and it's all luxury and ornament. And just no, I don't believe they have any real understanding of how the poor live. So there's this famous statement, which I believe is apocryphal, that they have somebody comes to Marie Antoinette and says the people are rioting, they have no bread, and she says, well, let them eat cake. And now this isn't true, but I think it illustrates the central issue in at the time, which is that she just had no understanding that if you said they have no cake, they have no bread, then she's like, well, have cake, have something else. If there's no bread, how no, how's that? Like, no, they don't have cake either. They don't have anything. That it was just this huge divorce between these two people, between these two groups of people. Not even a divorce, but a separation, just a distance. And it became incredibly violent. It became incredibly bloody. And ultimately, vast amounts of people were executed, including Louis XVI, including Marie Antoinette. including just loads of aristocracy. And it was an absolute, it became anarchy. Sort of no rule, it became an absolute bloodshed. So, and this was a thing that people in Britain were really worried about, because there were similar agitations in the UK. There were similar kind of situations of people just sort of people arguing with the monarchy. Like we had more, I think, in place in the way of channels between government and people, government and monarchy, but similar things were being raised. Similar questions were being asked in the UK of why do these people have power? Why do these people have wealth? Why do these people not have wealth? So we're looking quite early on in the revolution at this time. Things are starting to stir up in terms of Britain. We will see as we get sort of later on in the course, as we get through to I guess, well, I mean, actually, throughout, I think there are different points of revolution within the UK as well, and I think the France becomes a great warning. I think if we hadn't had the warning of France, the UK would have gone into a greater revolution than it ever did. But having seen what happened in France, and the bloodshed and the violence and the war, and the war absolutely decimated France for years, and we sort of think of it. It culminating in 1789, where we have sort of the storming of the Bastille, which is the great prison. We were trying to sort of break out all the people who were in there. We have the mass executions of the aristocracy. We have people like Wordsworth and Coleridge back in the UK who are getting excited by all the ideas that happened before that, was people are publishing things saying, hey, we need democracy, we need to get rid of this one person with all the power and everybody else. They get really thrilled by that idea and go, yes, great, yes, we need to change things. And then they see what happens, they see all the bloodshed, they see all the violence, and they suddenly retract. And they become really, really cautious, understandably. And then when we get into the second generation later on, we see people like Byron and Shelley agitating against, and because they were born after the revolution, or at least kind of born at a point they were too young to be aware of, significantly aware of it, to live through it. They're agitating again, and there's lots of kind of riots within the UK that things really look like they're all going to kick off there. So that is the context of what is happening in this poem. Charlotte Smith, so what's the date in Charlotte Smith? I'm just looking at the beginning of it here. It's 1792 is the first part of this poem. Now, there are two books to this poem, two parts. So I've asked you to read part one as as sort of the core reading. I think that's probably the most useful. If you're right, I will talk a little bit about what happens in part two as well. Between part one and part two, Louis XVI is executed. So she writes at a point already knowing that things are really bad in France. There's already been bloodshed and murder and war and terrible things happening. And then the king is beheaded. And she has to kind of come back to this and go, oh my God. And she writes specifically about Marie Antoinette, who at that point had not been executed, and about Marie Antoinette and about her son, who's just a little baby boy, who's an infant prince, and she's just going, what is the life waiting for you? Your only crime at this point is being born rich, essentially being born a prince. So that's I think our setup. So yes, sorry. As we start, 1792. We start with Charlotte Smith sitting or walking. I'll call me in a second. She's on the cliffs in Sussex. Hang on, let me share the screen so we can do that. Where put it? Yeah, immigrants. Where is the little magic zoom button gone? There's the zoom button. Okay. Can we all see this? Okay. Lovely, lovely. I'm going to be going back and forward here because I have an annotated copy on my over here with the scribbles all over it. So, okay, morning in November 1792. We begin with a fairly pleasant, not pleasant, but a fairly poetic description. Slow the wintry morn, the struggling light throws a faint gleam upon the troubled waves. Okay, we're not going to go through the entire poem at this level of slowness, but I am going to take a minute to just unpack that. It's morning, it's winter, it's cold. Smith is immediately juxtaposing the emotional state within one of a kind of pathetic fallacy, within the context of nature. So it's winter, things aren't growing, things aren't coming to life, it's the coldest period of the year. And it's morning. It's morning over the troubled waves, light over the troubled waves. And I think that kind of, the gleam from the troubled waves slightly summarizes everything that we're about to see in the next, well, here we have it divided into pages. Because she is talking about how many people regret to wake up in the morning. And this is, classic Smith misery. She's fantastic, but she's miserable. And you can't blame her for being miserable, or you can't blame an awful lot of these people for being miserable. But she says, so the bone chops perch the shore, board surf, and the season breaks, catches the beams, pale sun. Even the sun with reluctance gives light to the cold. And here it is. Alas, how few the morning wakes to joy. How few people wake up in the morning and go, oh, good, another day. Says no, instead of how many murmur at oblivion night for leaving them so soon. I'm getting a lot of background noise, by the way. I don't know if somebody's not on mute. Seb, I think it might be you there. Thank you. Feel free to unmute as soon as anyone has anything to say. So yes, how many murmur at the oblivious night for leaving them so soon, that there is sort of this, bearing thus their fancied bliss away, the only bliss they taste. The only time so many people are happy is when they are asleep and they are dreaming of other things. Yes, please do have a copy of the text if it is a digital one or in your books, and make notes as we're going through, and wave and ask any questions as we go through, because I think this is going to be useful. If you are submitting this, by the way, for your annotated poem, for the portfolio element, you wouldn't need to do the entire first part. I'm going to give you some examples. Hopefully next week I'll manage to get them together, of an appropriate amount of poem. You need to be providing about 500 words of criticism on it. But obviously if you do this entire thing, they become slightly less profound and interesting points. So, we are changing the dreams that soothe their sorrows for calamities. So reality comes in, and we all kind of regret this. No, we don't. We have sad lives, doubts, diseases, abject dread of death, faithless friends, fame and fortune lost, fancied or real wants. And I think this is a really nice point, fancied or real wants, because it just speaks of Smith's understanding that even if your wants aren't real, they're only imagined. So maybe there's something you really feel like, oh, if I had this, I would be happier. Even if this isn't a huge loss in your life, that is still a suffering experience for you. She puts great emphasis on individual experience and great empathy for what people want, even, wounded pride. That's something she's like, yes, that's a sad thing. That is, I'm sorry for you. And so this is the beginning of the day. Oh, sorry. I think we have some nice, fairly romantic description here of everything that's kind of the sun rising, the moon going. I love this. If but a sea mew falls. I love the word sea mew. That's just for a seagull. I think we should bring back this term because they do have a slightly mewing sound to their crying. It's very cute. And so there's a kind of question here of, okay, what is God doing here? What is God's response to what he is seeing? Which actually is quite unusual within a lot of romantic work. There are some great atheistic romantic writers, but even though there are plenty who aren't, there isn't the same emphasis on God. People don't write about God in the way that times previously, and certainly times following, if we think of the Victorian era follows, there's much more of an awareness of, okay, let's really construe all this in a Christian idea. So this, she comes back to, she sets up with kind of what is God doing here is kind of her question, and sort of going, no, God cares about nature, he cares about everything he has created, and then it's mankind here that is messing everything up. Misguided man, mars the fair work that he was bid enjoy. She will come back to God at the end of the second book, and the second book essentially ends in a prayer, just going, "Dear God, help us. We're really messed up here." So it's sort of that God has created something very soft and subtle and beautiful, and yet man is in here messing it up. Mars the fair work he's bid enjoy, makes himself the evil he deplores. And then she takes it personal. Ooh. We're using this very old laptop that is someone else's laptop. It's a different laptop, kind of laptop I'm used to using, and every now and then it just does things that I don't understand. So here we are. She takes this into her own personal situation. How often do I half abjure society, and sigh for some lone cottage, deep embowered in the green woods, and that these steep chalky hills guard from the strong southwest. So she's kind of saying, okay, well, this is an incredibly romantic idea of could one escape the world and go and live in a cottage, and the sanctity of nature, and nature being a kind of escape from so much of the world's troubles. And this idea of nature being an escape is one that Smith starts and then rejects. Like she ultimately says, well, no, this is part of the world, it's part of the same world. And I think this develops later on in the romantic ideology of a kind of nature becomes almost a revolutionary force, and it becomes almost the answer. I think there's a lot here that Smith is still kind of testing out with these ideas of nature. And sort of saying, oh, could I run away, essentially? There's so here further down we have the beauteous works of God, unspoiled by man. There's sort of like, oh, if I could get to a place where mankind hasn't ruined stuff, hasn't messed stuff up. But obviously, as soon as somebody goes there, they're starting to change that pure natural state. And be less affected then by human woes I witnessed not. So if I didn't have to witness things, okay, I might be a little bit happier. Might better learn to bear those that injustice, duplicity, and faithlessness and folly fix on me. So there's both the kind of the individual things of what has happened to her, injustice, duplicity, faithlessness, folly. And then there are the woes of the outside world, and both of these affect her very deeply. When my swollen heart was bursting with its sorrows from the sad thought that others like myself live but to swell affection's countless tribes, tranquil seclusion I have vainly sought. So she has tried, but she has not had comfort. She hasn't kind of received that peace. Peace who no more delights in downy shade will no more spread from me her downy wings. But like the fabled Danaïds of the wretch who ceaseless up the steep acclivity was doomed to heave the still rebounding rock, onward I labour. It's the baffled wave. Okay, a minor point here the kind of the references to Greek and Roman mythology coming in here. And we have like, so you probably know the myth of Sisyphus, how well you might know it or not, but Sisyphus is the one who has to push the rock up the hill. He's doomed to forever push a rock up the hill, and then it rolls back down the hill, and then he has to push it back up the hill. Like, ouch. Good metaphor for just living in useless toil. There's been quite a bit written on romantic use of Greek and Roman mythology. One is a kind of an aspiration to classicism, as a kind of being part of a dialogue. So if you use this, it kind of shows that you're in with the group, that you're in with other people, and particularly people kind of looked at female writers' use of essentially classical illusion, and sort of saying that this is often a way of female writers sort of proving themselves, particularly if they haven't had education comparable to, many of the male writers we're going to look at have been to Eton and to Cambridge and had the best education in the land. And a lot of the female writers have been home educated, or Smith did have some education in early life, but certainly obviously didn't go to university or anything like that. So I think there's a sort of sense of going, no, I'm here, I'm on the same page as you guys. So anyway, she's using this here, going on. As the baffled wave, which you rough beach repulses, the return, the next breath of wind to fail again. Ah, mourner, cease these wailings. Cease and learn. So she kind of says, it's not enough just to sit alone and be sad. Cease and learn that not the cot sequester or the briarwood and one with that blah blah blah. And she goes, and then she does this sort of great long list of all of these lovely rustic places, the village church. Like, none of these things are going to help you. Nothing can shut out for an hour the spectre care. When you care, and this word care, I guess, has interesting meanings, because they would often use care in the sense that we might sort of say careworn, and you might talk about someone's face as being careworn, sort of plagued by troubles. But there is also the meaning of caring, as in, feeling affectionately for things, and I think this is something that Smith particularly hits, the empathy and misery at the same time. Oh, for goodness sake. Don't like this computer. Okay. Now, we're on to what is here, page 7. I'm not quite sure what's going to be in your books. I don't have my book. Behold, the word behold. Okay, this is where I put a great big line through the poem and go, okay, that's part 1, is what we've seen before, is her reflections on individual care, on misery, on learning, and how we're gonna deal with our own individual misery and care. And then the second part is we're gonna have the emigrants. We are gonna see the emigrants. Behold, in witness of this mortal truth, a group approach me. So she sees then this group of people walking along the seashore, and that is going to make her descriptions of these people is going to make up the bulk of this poem. So she sees this group of people, and instantly their looks tell them how sad they are, whose dejected looks, sad heralds of distress, proclaim them men banished forever, and for conscience sake from their distracted country, whence the name of freedom misapplied and much abused by lawless anarchy has driven them far to wander. Let's just take a moment here. So obviously this is the reference to the French Revolution. Proclaim the men banished forever from their country, and for conscience sake. Sorry, muddled that up there, but yes, we go. So these are people who have been banished. They have left their home country. Why? The name of freedom misapplied. And I think that's the fundamental crux of the French Revolution, of the discussion at the time, is that this is freedom. It's all in pursuit of freedom, which is obviously a pure and wonderful thing. But the word freedom is being misapplied in that we're treating people terribly. We're killing people in some attempt to try and get it. The word anarchy, I'll take a quick moment to look over. Anarchy very literally means lawlessness. Since this time, since the time Smith is writing, since the revolution, there has been a kind of movement of political anarchy, of people sort of trying to put this forward of, oh, one could actually live lawlessly but positively and kindly. That meaning of the word hadn't at all come in. Anarchy was just seen, it was only used negatively. This is lawlessness, and it is lawlessness of violence and excess and just everything going horrifically wrong. The prejudice they learned from bigotry, the tutoress of the blind. I think that's a fantastic description, bigotry being the tutor of the blind. To the wild world unsheltered, their sole hope that German spoilers through that pleasant land may carry wide the desolate scourge of war and vengeance. Yet, here we go. So she's kind of at this point saying, okay, they have been blinded by bigotry. They have misapplied the words of freedom. These guys aren't exactly winning. They're not exactly heroes in her eyes. But then she says here, yet, unhappy men, whatever your errors, I lament your fate. And she will come back to this sentiment a couple of times. Whatever you have done, I still feel sorry for you. It isn't a, well, you deserve this. As disconsolate and sad you hang upon the barrier of rock and seem to murmur your despondence, waiting long for some fortunate reverse that never comes, methinks I see in each expressive face, I see discriminated anguish. So this is her empathy, and I think it's important that at the beginning she has set up her own misery, and she will return to it later on, again, without going into the details of why it has happened, why it has occurred to her that things have gone wrong in her life. But she does kind of say, well, look, I have understanding of this. I've been put in terrible positions so I can feel other people's pain. And I suppose, I guess there's the hope that these people who are being pained themselves are going to see other people's pain as well and learn from it. I feel her purpose here is an educational one. It is a let's try and understand people and feel for the sufferings that they experience. So from this point onward, she starts to go through them one by one. And then bear with me, I need to take my sweater off. I have definitely overestimated how much I needed to turn the heating up this morning. So from here on in, she's going to describe them one by one. So we have the first one. The Drupes one, who in a moping cloister long consumed this life inactive to obtain a better, and thought that meager abstinence to wake from his hard palate with the midnight bell, to live on, oh, I hate this word, eleemosynary bread, and to renounce God's work would please that God. Now, this is basically a monk, I think. It could be somebody who's no, we have the reference to the palace and the midnight bell. So yes, it is a monk. It's someone who is very devout, living their life for God. Now, in lots of ways, people would go, "Oh, how good! Somebody who is a monk." But she's quite critical of the life of monks. Basically, she says, you've been consumed by life inactive. He's not been living. He's not been helping. Not been doing anything. He thought that meager abstinence, and abstinence is hard, and she's just going, look, if you do all the things that you reject in order to serve God, that's not what God wants. To renounce God's works, she actually calls monkhood renouncing God's works, i.e., renouncing all the beautiful things in the world that God has made. Food, wine, drink, love, going places, traveling, pleasures, luxuries, all of these things. She doesn't. Well, that's actually, she's not going into great detail there, but she's just going, that's what God made. Why would God make that? So definitely constructing this person as misled, as wrong. And now the poor pale wretch receives amazed the pity strangers give to his distress, because these strangers are, by his dark creed, condemned as heretics, and with sick hearts regrets his pious prison and his beads. So kind of this would be a Catholic clergy that she's looking at. So the Catholic monk, and we're going to see some clergymen next. Obviously, England is predominantly Protestant at this time, so there's kind of the distinction of religions here as well. So the monk is already regretting. Another, of more haughty port, declines the aid he needs not, while in mute despair his high indignant thoughts go back to France, dwelling on all he lost, the Gothic dome that vied with splendid palaces, the beds of silken down, the silver chalices, vestments with golden wrought for blazing altars, where amid clouds of incense he held forth to kneeling crowds the imaginary bones of saints supposed, in pearl and gold enchased. And still with more than living monarch's pomp surrounded, he was believed by mumbling bigots to hold the keys of heaven, and to admit whom he thought good to share it. Okay, what are we looking at here? We're looking at some kind of clergyman. I don't think there's any clue to tell us exactly what degree he is. I mean, he could be a bishop or something like this, but he's the level of clergy that has lots of luxury, all kinds of luxury. Here is quite self-important. You know, it's high indignant thoughts here. The Gothic dome is kind of referring to the Gothic architecture of the church. And saying, okay, this is a church that vies with palaces. So she's kind of connecting it there with the aristocracy. And there's a great deal of suspicion towards the church, because in France, the church and the state were so closely entwined, and both did kind of have these elements of opulence about them. So these are all the things that he has: the silken chests, the silken down beds, silver chalices. He's got everything. And again, she's belittling the religion, because she's saying, okay, he's holding forth to kneeling crowds the imaginary bones of saints supposed. So this is kind of the idea of relics in a church, saying, oh, these are the bones of Saint so-and-so. And she's going, well, are they the bones? Are there any bones in there? Are they really those bones? Is that person really a saint anyway? Sure, lots of interesting theological questions. And this idea, believed by mumbling bigots to hold the keys to heavens and to admit whom he thought good to share it. So these people who have very small imaginations are going, yeah, he's a bishop, or whatever level he might be. He is the one who can get you into heaven. Now, alas, we come to the change. What has changed for him? He, to whose daring soul and high ambition the world seems circumscribed, who wanted to dream of Fleury, Richelieu, Alberoni, men who trod on empire, politics were not beyond the grasp of his vast mind, is in a land once hostile, still profaned by disbelief and rites unorthodox, the object of compassion. So what's interesting here, actually, as between the monk and the priest, bishop, whatever he is, again, I don't think we exactly know, people are giving them alms. So the relief is being offered to them. This is presumably just passers-by, just giving them some money, just a little bit. No, these poor beggar people. The monk accepts it, going, "Oh my God, I can't believe this." The clergyman rejects it. I mean, he's probably got some more wealth anyway. He's probably got goods about him that he can sell and so on. But there is kind of the at that point, the French Catholic Church absolutely denounced Protestant religions, and so there's something about the kind of the way he is looking at the British people, the English people who are around him, who are mostly Protestant, and sort of trying to understand, like, it's a big surprise that these people are compassionate and are giving him money. Oh yeah, and at his side, lighter of heart than these, but heavier far than he was wont, another victim comes, an abbé who with less contracted brow still smiles and flatters, still talks of hope, which, sanguine as he is, he does not feel, and so he cheats the sad and weighty pressure of evils present. Still, as men misled by early prejudice, so hard to break. Such a good point there. I mean, misled by early prejudice. We tend to believe the things we are taught when we are children. It's very hard to shake off the set of beliefs we are brought up with, particularly if everyone around us believes them. So even you are men misled by early prejudice, I mourn your sorrows. And she's still there saying, like, I still think you're wrong. I think you're wrong because you've been taught the wrong things, but I'm still sorry for you. And then she kind of brings in, I too have known involuntary exile. And so she talks a little bit then about how much she missed their positions reversed. They're French being exiled in England, she was English being exiled in France. While yet England had charms for me, I felt how sad it is to look across the dim cold sea that melancholy rolls its refluent tides between us, and the dear regretted land we call our own. So think about we're in Sussex and we're looking across the sea that if we had good enough eyesight, we could see France. Let me just kind of look on how far do we want to. Any questions or anything at this point? Cool. I'm just looking at it. We'll want to go on to. Oh, gazing on the waters seem to lead you ashore from whence the wind is loaded to your ears the deep groans of martyred saints and suffering royalty, while to your eyes the avenging power of heaven appears in awful anger to prepare the storm of vengeance fraught with plagues and death. Even he of milder heart, who was indeed a simple shepherd in a rustic scene. So yeah, so we have now blah, blah, blah. Okay. Yeah, so we're still talking of the abbey, but in talking of the abbey, we're also talking of the shepherd who essentially served him. So this is kind of one of the lower class people, the simple shepherd in a rustic scene, amid vine-clad hills of Languedoc, taught to the barefoot peasant, whose hard hands produced the nectar he could seldom taste, submission for the Lord to the Lord from whom he toiled. Okay, this is the revolution in a nutshell. This is everything that people were fighting for. There is a barefooted peasant who is producing the nectar he could seldom taste. That could be kind of anything. Like probably is going to be some kind of wine goods, but any kind of food goods. There are people who labor to create things that they never get to taste themselves, and this is then provided to the abbes, to the priests, to the bishops, who then teach them to revere God and to improve themselves to get into heaven. I'm going to switch on a little further because I want to get to the good stuff. Doing quite a bit more of the priests there, and if we move on to even such a man comes in exile, the novel sound. Okay, here this is nice. Okay, yes. So this is a little bit more. The pastor. So this is kind of coming a little bit further down the clergy, to the person who is so much closer to. Well, I think she calls him here the flock, the parishioners. Even such a man becomes an exile, staying not to try by temperate zeal to check his maddening flock. So just a slight warning, just kind of, he could have maybe tried to help, but he's not. He's fled to save himself. But the maddening flock, I think, is great. Who at the novel sound of liberty, most intoxicating sound to slaves, start into license. So again, there is sympathy for the people who are rioting, for the poor who have gotten this idea of, okay, we can claim back power, we can claim wealth and riches and all these things these people have that we don't, And that, yes, they run to extremes. You know, this is an intoxicating sound, the sound of liberty. These people have been slaves their entire life. They have just existed to serve other people. And now they have the sound of liberty, and it becomes intoxicating. So like drink, it overwhelms the senses, it misleads and it misguides us. And then this line I think is lovely. The wandering pastor, the line that immediately follows that, the wandering pastor mourns with bleeding heart his erring people, and weeps and prays for them and trembles for the account that he must give to heaven for the souls entrusted to his care. So this one kind of talking about, okay, the man who had a higher position over these people was supposed to be their protector. One, he is genuinely worried for them. I think that's nice. That, you know, he mourns with bleeding heart and weeps and prays. He seems genuinely really sorry for these people and for the violence that they have ended up in, and sort of almost worries, saying, "I was supposed to be their moral guidance. What am I to do?" Now, that is the end of our kind of clergy bit, and then we move on to a softer form. To heavens for souls entrusted to his care, where the cliff, the hollow by the wintry storm, affords a seat, with matted seaweed strewn, a softer form reclines. Around her run, on the rough shingles or chalky bourne, her gay unconscious children. So now we have the image of a mother. And all these children, I think, by the way, in the first video, I've mixed these up of which order these occur in. So we have the clergyman first, and then we get the image of the mother, and the joy and innocence of children. You know, they're picking up the stones, they're picking up shells, they're making little fairy vessels, making little boats that fairies could glide in, and playing them around on the pool. Happy age, unmindful of the miseries of man. These children are exiles too, they are sufferers too, but they don't know it yet. They still have the innocence and joy of childhood. But the mother is obviously in absolute distress, lost in melancholy thought, lulled for a moment by murmurs low of sudden billows, wearied by the task of having here, with swollen and aching eyes fixed on the great horizon since the dawn, solicitously watched the weekly sail from her dear native land. And yet now yields a while to kind forgetfulness. And so that's the nice kind of moment of going back to what we had about dreams at the beginning, that the only respite here is where we can get away from reality. And so we learn now that this woman is actually was very rich, was probably quite aristocratic, because we are told that she sort of has a kind of forgetfulness, while fancy brings in waking dreams the native land again. So she goes back to France in her mind, and she thinks of Versailles. And Versailles is this fantastic magical, it's not magical, but it's basically, it looks magical. This fantastic palace. If you're not familiar with Versailles, give it a Google, look at the pictures. It's glorious. Where by long mirrors multiplied, the crowd paid willing homage to the queen. And united there, beauty gave charms to empire. I mean, beauty giving charms to empire, I think, is nice. You know, that Versailles was built as this magnificent palace. And it's very easy to, I guess, get suckered into sort of believing in crown and monarchy and these things, and that these people are doing good, that empire is doing good, when you go to the palace and everything is so beautiful and so lovely, and you think, oh yes, this seems right. To be misled by ornament, essentially. See the sad mourner start. So she's shaken away from her reverie, and drooping look with tearful eyes and heaving bosom round on drear reality. I feel like this is one of the very early examples of the power of imagination. So we're going to talk a lot more about the power of imagination when we get to Keats and Coleridge, which I think is week 5, maybe something like that. There's a point where Coleridge kind of says imagination is as good as anything in reality. And I think there's a poem, this lime tree bower in my prison, in which all of his friends have come around. He's got some kind of illness. I think he's got a bad foot, and his friends have come around, and they've all decided to go for a walk, and he has to be left behind, and he's sort of feeling a bit like, oh, this is really this. The poem begins going, oh, I'm really sad, I'm left behind. My friends have gone off to have fun, And then he thinks about the walk and he thinks about where they are. And the imagination is so strong for him that he sort of goes, well, actually, this is just as good. I'm having a great time. And I think what that becomes in Coleridge is set up here in Smith's kind of insistence of, okay, imagination is the only good time these people have. If it's dreams and it's just absolute fantasy, or if it's memory of a happier time. Coleridge thence, a fellow sufferer comes, so we get to another member of this party, and this is the nobleman, the aristocrat. He checks but not quite conceals under martial air the high consciousness of noble blood, which he has learned from infancy to think exalts him o'er the race of common man. So he has been taught this. This isn't his own conceited opinion he's arrived to by himself. He has been taught from his infancy that he is better than the common man because he is of noble blood. Fed by adulation, could he learn that worth alone is true nobility? We have the quote from Thomson here, and she goes on here a little bit about sons of France, men who derive their boasted ancestry, and talks about kind of the ancestry and all the images that appear in the sort of the chivalry pages, the names that are prestigious, the images on the heraldry, on kind of the shields and so on, and sort of. I never quite know what to sort of make of this, because yes, I think it's quite it's a fair observation. But something slightly made up about this when she talks about the images. So if you think of the nobility, they so often have a coat of arms of some sort, which would traditionally be on shields of knights and so on, but often is just kind of used decoratively in noble houses. And they always have these weird symbols on them. So she describes the fantastic hand mingles, like images in feverish dreams, gorgons, hydras, and chimeras dire, painted puns and visionary shapes. I think she's just sort of highlighting the absurdity of it. Of, we have this nobility and these people are noble because they have this special shield, and it's sort of weird. It sounds like something from a terrifying dream, sort of Alice in Wonderland gone wrong. Gorgons, hydras, and chimeras dire. What is all of that? So I think she's just kind of not exactly mocking it, but just sort of pointing at the strangeness of it all. And then, yeah, this is great. This is almost appreciation of nature, almost becoming something moral. Because as long as one who long has dwelt amid the artificial scenes of populous city, so she has no kind of respect for the city, no appreciation for the city, sorry, that the city is artificial. So it is an artifice, it is created by man. It is not real in some sense. Deemed that splendid shows, the theatre, the pageant, pomp of courts are only worth regard, forgets all taste for nature's genuine beauty. And she sort of goes on then to sort of talk about the things that could be counted as nature's genuine beauty, and the sounds, the wind, the ocean, the light of the sun, everything, all these beautiful things. He can't appreciate them. And this is really a kind of an indictment upon him. He is so far gone in his own bizarre little world, in this sort of terrible world of cityness, that he cannot appreciate what is so obviously beautiful and magnificent in nature. Yes, we need a little bit more on him, because we need this a little bit. So to his mind, she's kind of, so this is sort of the absolute. This is the wealthy. This is the wealthiest. This is the nobleman. This is not even kind of the clergy, who at least have their calling, their moral guide in some way. And she talks here about slavery. Now, it's difficult to. She speaks very passionately on the abolition movement later on, which I'll probably touch on a little bit when we have our session on the abolition movement. I don't think she's just talking about what we would call literal legal slavery, but I think she's talking about slavery in a broader sense to be just the plight of the poor, who essentially didn't have any opportunity to go anywhere else, didn't have any opportunity to make any money, didn't have opportunity to do anything other than serve these people who were their masters. Yes. So Tesman, long as live where despotism hides his features half beneath despotism hides beneath a diadem. So a diadem is like a kind of crown. Abject slavery seems as if by that power imposed, slavery no more. When slavery is created by grandeur, it almost doesn't seem like slavery. For luxury wreathes with silk the iron bonds and hides the ugly rivulets with flowers. Sorry, the ugly rivets with flowers, till the degenerate triflers, while they love the glitter of the chains, forget their weight. So essentially, just say this is the people are removed from the harshness, the sufferings of the world, the sufferings that are required to support this aristocracy. They are hidden. So the ugly rivets are hidden with flowers, and this love the glitter of the chains, i.e., so the bonds of slavery, whatever mechanisms those might be that society has in place, they create beautiful things for a certain number of people. And that in that beautiful society where everything is adorned and everything is perfect, one can forget the weight of the chains. One can forget the terrible suffering that these things cause. Now, I'm just thinking, we're taking a little while on this. Do we want a quick sort of 10-minute break? I'm aware I'm talking at you quite intensely. And it might be nice to just have a brief respite. Yeah? Okay. That's a fairly abrupt stopping in the middle of things, but I'm realizing we've got a little way to go. So let's take a little pause there. Shall we just take 10 minutes? So it's 11:17. Try and be back for 11:27, and we'll get going at past. And we can check back in there with any questions we might have about what we've got so far, and then we'll finish off the last part of that. Okay. Beautiful. Pause are great. But some people sort of think, oh no, it's a really sincere explanation. Any impressions?
I think it's interesting how, because yesterday we were doing gender, obviously, and we were speaking about the French Revolution, how it changes. Sorry, my dogs are just fighting in the background. They're literally fighting. So I think it's interesting how, because we were saying how women became, everything became a bit more conservative after the French Revolution, and it seems a bit different for Charlotte Smith, because it seems quite strong of her to come back here without her husband with all those kids. Like, it seems quite, do you know what I mean? It doesn't seem very like traditional conservative family. So yeah, I think that was interesting.
And I think the kind of the idea of the conservative term after the revolution is quite a bit later than this. This is still very much within the Revolutionary Wars. It's really kind of ongoing. And so with the way I think a lot of the Romanticism falls within that more radical questioning period, really up until the 1820s. And then kind of we start to see things becoming much more, okay, no, we've got to shut this down, we've got to be careful. And then we get into the Victorian era, and when Victoria gets on the throne, that's like feels like a dividing point in terms of like, oh, yeah. So is this for 19th century novel that you guys are doing, is that right? Is that the other module you're doing? Is that when you're talking about this?
Yeah, I think gender and I can't remember the name. Yeah.
Yeah, the one that Sarah's doing, yeah. Yeah, cool. I know what you're talking about. What are you looking at on that module, by the way? What are your books and so on?
We're next week we're doing Sense and Sensibility.
Oh, Jolts.
But yeah, before we were just looking at Stickney Ellis and more. More. They're what are they called again? The books.
You broke up.
They're like instructional manual books. Thing. Oh, I can't remember the name. Sorry, I know my Wi-Fi is dodgy.
The thing that was great though was that it said, "What are the names of the books?" What books?
What are they called again? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. She's going much earlier than people often do on that course. So that's great fun actually getting Austen, because that segues in very nicely. Because obviously Austen is time period wise a romantic. It's often like hotly disputed whether or not she is a romantic, because she doesn't do a lot of the romantic stuff. But that's very cool. Okay, well, shall we get back into the poem, and we will finish off book 1 and see how we're doing on time when we do so. So hang on, let me share the screen so you can all see. Okay. So we've been going through all the list of people that you've seen walking along the beach. All of these, all of these emigrants. Okay. Literary chains that forget their weight, common men. Yeah, so here we kind of have the men of success, whose ill-acquired wealth was wrung from plundered myriads, but means too often legalized by power, abused, feel all the horrors of the fatal change. But this is kind of about men who have succeeded perhaps by not particularly ethical, but by perfectly legal means, but don't have the honor of nobility to comfort them. And she kind of said, well, they've actually got a particularly hard task, because poor unlamented sink and know that they deserve the woes they feel. So this is kind of sort of new money people, merchants. Similarly, they have made power by essentially there's a word, exploiting the working class, but they don't have that prestige of aristocracy. However empty a thing it might be in Smith's eyes, it is at least some comfort to the people who have it. Let's see. Poor wandering wretches, whosoe'er ye are, that hopeless, houseless, friendless travel wide over these bleak russet downs, where dimly seen the solitary shepherd shivering tends his undiscovered flock. This is an interesting point here. The solitary shepherd shivering tends his dun-discoloured flock. This is just a really small note. So she's talking about all these people who are homeless, and she just mentions, you're amongst the shepherd now. You basically have as much as the shepherd does. And this is really briefly. She just says, a shepherd unlike the shepherds of poets' fancy. Crown. So you often get these kind of pastoral scenes, poems in which a shepherd is an idyllic job to have, and they gamble in the field and they play with the lambs, and he's crowned with garlands. His crook has lots of violets all bound over it. I think if we think of William Blake, he does this a lot. He's very guilty of idealizing the shepherd, but plenty before him. A long tradition of pastoral in which the shepherd was an icon of innocence and loveliness and springtime. And it's just a mention here that the shepherd actually has a pretty rough life. He's shivering, tending a dun-discoloured flock, so that these aren't fluffy white sheep. They're all discoloured by weather and mishap and mud and all kinds of stuff. We will see later on in this course this kind of an interest in the rural poor, and at times an idealization of them, but it's an idealization that tries to get much more at the harsh realities of their life, of the difficulties of being a shepherd or whatever. Basically, being poor and living in the country, and what is that? What is the life actually like for those people? So just a little tiny note there that she's just sort of adding in there. Now we're about to come to the attack, aren't we? Poor wandering wretches. The shepherd who receives no parish, who no abode receives, no parish owns. So this is the kind of the homelessness, the difficulty of not being owned by anyone, welcomed by anyone. And this here, I mean, this is sort of specifically in terms of the immigrants, but it can be in terms of, you know, the poor and the shepherd that we've just heard of as well. The land that boasts such general plenty. This is England. We have so much, and yet, which is luxuries are there, and yet people are kind of, so many have nothing. Yes. So here she kind of starts to talk as we get into this. But this is great. Oh yeah, sorry, just the previous, but she kind of talks about nobles. It's harder to actually be noble. The exiled nobles from their country driven, richest luxuries, whereas theirs must feel more poignant anguish than the lowest poor. It's almost harder to lose everything than to simply be born into poverty. Rather fortune's worthless favourites, who feed on England's vitals, pensioners of base corruption, who in quick ascent to opulence unmerited become giddy with pride, and as ye are rife, forgetting the duty they lately left, with scorn look down on those beneath you. So she's kind of started talking about the French aristocracy, but she is weaving it very, very subtly into the English aristocracy. And then we get the attack at this point. Ye venal, worthless hirelings of a court, ye pampered parasites, who Britons pay for forging fetters for them. So now she's talking of the aristocracy of England. So Britons pay for forging fetters. So the British pay their taxes to the kings, to the king singular, and to the governors, the parliament, and everyone. But they're paying them, and all they're getting in return is a kind of slavery. They're forging fetters. They're paying them to put people in their place and to not let you have liberty. Rather here study a lesson that concerns ye much. So she's saying, listen, you guys, look at these people. Look at these people who are wandering along the shores, these people who are suffering, who are in absolute pain. And she doesn't directly say, this is going to be you. But it's kind of, you know, it's implied there by saying this is a lesson, you should study it. The raging multitude will turn on their oppressors. So if oppressed too long, the raging multitude to madness stung will turn on their oppressors. This is the warning. So it isn't just, so it's the pity for these people who have come. She talks a little bit about France as an example here. Lawless anarchy o'erturn is celestial freedom's radiant throne, as now in Gallia, Gallia being France, an old name for what is now essentially France. It's linked to the word Gaul. As now in France, where confusion born of hearty rage and selfish love of rule sully the noblest cause that ever warmed the heart of patriot virtue. Noblest cause that ever warmed the heart of patriot virtue. That is governance, you know, that is looking after people, that is trying to make the world run well. And that is being corrupted, sullied by party rage and selfish love of rule. So this is the warning. This is it really becomes quite passionate and quite sort of demanding. And Smith is great fun, like looking at the language she uses. Do have a look at the introduction here, because she sort of goes, some people look at this as sort of a miniature epic, because it does have various epic features. and she sort of goes, "Oh, I'm not really using an epic tone because it's not my position to, a dainty female as I am," and she really sort of plays it as, "I know I'm a very nice young woman. I wouldn't do anything too shocking." But this is just this woman just yelling at Parliament, just going, "Stop what you are doing. You need to listen. Our people will rise up and overthrow you. The madness stunned, they will turn on their oppressors." So like, look at France. This, and she's not the only person saying this. Plenty of people are saying this, but she says it, I think, in a really unique and fascinating way, with this kind of this personal narrative, with the talk about her own suffering, with the talk about empathy for other people, but then to not just sort of keep it in what is often considered a very female sphere of caring and empathy and regret. She says, no, I'm also going to go and be political and address the people at the heart of this. So we are seeking in England an asylum. Oops, I haven't gone down yet. These are the people. These are the ill-starred exiles. They have left. They have suffered. They are now looking. We feel for them. We for them feel as our brethren. English hearts of just compassion ever own the sway as truly as our element of the deep obeys the mild dominion of the moon. But we care for them. We have to care for them. That is, she's sort of contextualizing that as a nationalistic feature, and this is quite bold to say, like, this is a fundamental part of being English, because very much as today, whenever you have influx of people immigrating from one country to another, there will be some part of that other country that goes, "Hey, no, we don't want these immigrants coming over here. This is no good." And lots of people were saying that. There's a lot of anti-French sentiment, and so she's here trying to set up compassion as an English sentiment just as much, and to sort of undo some of that harm and say, well, actually, no, this is what we do. We care. We look after people. And I mean, this is great. Learn that the God thou worshipst delights in acts of pure humanity. Learn that God, who you claim to worship, he likes it when people are nice. Shocking statement. May thine be still such bloodless laurels. So the laurel is like the crown of achievement, of something that is, absolutely often kind of considered in terms of learning, but often just sort of a mark of prestige. Let them be bloodless. Let them not be war. And the last few lines of this is a fear of war. Like, we need to beware of this. We need to beware of. So this last line, I think, is the deafening roar of victory from 1,000 brazen throats that tell with what success wide-waging war has by our brave compatriots thinned the world. So she's kind of saying there's no glory in us defeating France. There's no kind of great pride in saying, hey, we won, we are the best, we get to shout victory, if all that victory has done has thinned the world, i.e. has killed people, has taken vast numbers of people out of the world. So the kind of, we won't go all the way through book the second. But I'll just, have we got it there? Does that go on to the second one? So as I said, the difference in time is what? 4 months, I think. So that was November 1792. She writes the next piece in April 1793. So time. Oh no, I don't want that. That is just the next section, book 2. Come on, do book 2. Yay! Latin. Here we go. So yeah, time and April, an afternoon in April 1793. And then she kind of just sort of sets it up again. Oh, it's been long wintry months are past. And this is the point where she's kind of looking towards spring and sort of saying, gosh, things are getting worse, which actually, I think in a year like this, when we've sort of been much more aware of the seasons than I think we often are, and all kind of united and thinking, oh, what's it going to be like when we get to spring? That sort of rang particularly true for me, I think, this year in a way it hasn't before. And the devastation that has happened in between time, which is the execution of Louis XVI. And she sort of talks about him, that being like it wasn't his fault. This kind of idea she goes back to, that like he was born into that role. Whatever he did, that was never gonna sort of. It's not. This hasn't been caused by him and the sadnesses. So she talks about this quite particularly. It's just a little way down here. Reason would raise to liberty destroyed by ruffian hands. Well, the headless corpse, was a corpse, I think, being like corpse, like body, of one whose only crime was being born a monarch. Mercy turns from spectacles so dire. Her swollen eyes and liberty with calm and ruffled brow, and magnanimous and conscious of her strength. We go on the bit. I think the so I'm just trying to find the bit about Marie Antoinette. That's really interesting. Where is it? Yes. So this is a little way down here, sort of roughly about midway through this poem. We have the little child. Unfortunate his lot, whose luckless head thy jewelled circlet blind with thorns is bound. So this is the baby of Louis and Marie Antoinette, the heir to the throne. I'm happy for I'm going happy for France, and yeah. La, 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 la. Oh, sorry, it's further down there. So I'm getting. Not that far down. There we are. Innocent prisoner. There we go. So this is it's the same baby, but we come back to it a little bit later on. The most unhappy heir of fatal greatness. Thou art suffering now for all the crimes and follies of thy race. So you are suffering for what mankind does. And this goes back to the beginning when we think of the beauty of nature and how she sort of wanted to shut herself away from what man does to man. And so this is sort of this innocent baby is kind of being, sort of allied with herself in some sense there, that he is going to suffer for all of this. And she talks about a little shepherd baby. The shepherd lad who on the slope, not quite a baby, a small child, who on the slope abrupt of downy turf, reclined in playful indolence, sends off the chalky ball, quick bouncing far below, while half forgetting his sinful path. So she's just sort of comparing this prince to be with this shepherd boy. Now, we already know that she doesn't think a shepherd life is an idyllic thing or a joyful thing, or, oh, how lucky he is, he's a shepherd. But she's still kind of going, oh, better to be that shepherd child than to be the prince, basically, the one who's going to inherit this awful world, awful throne. And then she talks about Marie Antoinette here. Thy wretched mother, petrified with grief, views thee with stony eyes and cannot weep. How she knows that, particularly about Marie Antoinette, obviously she's just imagining it. But I guess being a mother of a child without a father, she is obviously familiar with with that particular situation. Much I mourn thy sorrows, hapless queen. And deem thy expiation made to heaven for every fault. So again, I forgive you of all your faults, essentially, which prosperity betrayed thee when it placed thee on a throne, where boundless power was thine, and thou wert raised high above the envious reach of destiny. I mean, one, high as it seemed above the envious reach of destiny, that as it seemed there, was I guess you thought you were safe, but you weren't. But again, just saying this isn't her fault. She's been placed in an insane position. She has been taught insane things. And still that forgiveness, whatever thy errors were, be they no more remembered. So this is before before she was executed, and it's a really beautiful kind of moment of a mother talking to her mother, just saying, "Gosh, I feel your pain so much." The final part of this poem is absolutely actually really tough reading. I find it quite sort of upsetting as I try and read it through. She basically just imagines a scene of war, and just kind of goes into the details of there's at one point there's a woman running away with her baby and just trying to protect her baby, and it's the only child she's got left. She's lost, I think, about 8 of them or something so far, and this is all she's got, and she's running into the mountains fleeing soldiers. And it's never quite made clear if these scenes of war are ones that are currently happening in France or one that she fears might come to England, which I think she does very much on purpose, and just shows the destruction of war, the absolute fear that we really should tell. And just going to come to the very, very last page of this. We've had this great big picture of war, and then she addresses God and just said, "Oh, power omnipotent, with mercy view this suffering globe. Teach the hard hearts of rulers that the poorest kind who dies for their unrighteous quarrels is equal to the imperious lord that leads his disciplined destroyers to the field." I'm just saying, anyone who dies in battle is worth as much as the king, as the lords, as whoever is leading them into battle, which is an incredibly democratic ideal, and would be very strongly criticized by many of the many philosophers at the time, who were still kind of in a, well, some people are more important than other kind of mindset. So I mean, I genuinely think it's an extraordinary work of literature, an incredibly important one. I hope that going through part 1 has helped to get your head around it, and I think as the more we go through, you will see more resonances in this in various different ways. I would very strongly recommend reading the second half. I think it is great. Who's had a look at any of the sonnets, by the way, that were up there? Has anyone had a chance to look at any of those? There was one that I talked about in the video. The sonnets are probably much more accessible. I think if we'll take just a few more minutes, I'll just show you a couple of. So these are on the slides. I've got 2 copies of the slides open, haven't I? Never mind. Spelogenic sonnets quite a bit earlier than the emigrants that we've just been looking at. One of their nice little sonnets, so they're quite accessible. I don't read them. That's the one I've written about in the video, which is just the individual sitting by the shore and feeling sad. That sounds really dull, but it's really good. This one fantastically connects to what we see at the beginning of the emigrants, of sleep being escape. She just says, "Come balmy sleep, tired nature's soft resort, on these sad temples all thy poppies shed, and bid gay dreams from Morpheus' airy court float in light visions on my aching heart." I don't just come and let me dream for a while. Silence all of these miseries that are going on. Okay, let's actually quickly look at the Nightingale. That's a beautiful one, and it's going to come in. It's going to be useful when we come to Keats. So it's traditional sonnet form. She plays around a little bit with some of the rhyme schemes. Doesn't just use Shakespearean or Petrarchan. She tends to invent her own a little bit. But otherwise, it's a very conventional structure. "Poor melancholy bird that all night long tells to the moon thy tender tale of woe. From what sad cause can such sweet sorrow flow? And whence this mournful melody of song?" Okay, this is classic romantic stuff. Listening to the song of the nightingale and going, "Oh, it sounds so sad. Isn't it beautiful? What has caused you this pain?" Now, she then brings herself into the poem, "Thy poet's musing." Okay, who's thy poet? It's her. She's talking to the nightingale. She is the poet who's writing the Nightingale poem. Thy poet's musing fancy would translate. So fancy would translate, her imagination would translate. She hears the bird song and her imagination would turn it into something. What mean the sounds that swell thy little breast when still at dewy eve thou leav'st thy nest, thus to the listening night to sing thy fate? Obviously, if you're not aware, I'm sure you can work that out. The nightingale is a bird that sings at night. So it's leaving the nest. It should be comfortable. Why isn't it comfortable and cozy in its own nest? Pale sorrow's victims wert thou once among, though now released in woodlands wild to rove. Say, hast thou felt from friends some cruel wrong, or diest thou, martyr of disastrous love? Ah, sad songstress sad, that such my lot might be, to sigh and sing at liberty like thee. And so this is very interesting, because she's sort of saying, okay, what has happened to you? Were you once a victim of sorrow? So she's doing some referring back to mythology here of Philomena, who's she was raped by one of the gods, and I can't remember who particularly. One of them, probably Zeus. Normally Zeus. She was viciously raped, and then she was turned into a nightingale so that she couldn't tell anyone about it. And it's this absolutely heartbreaking story, incredibly beautiful. So were you a victim of sorrow that has now been released in the woodlands wild to rove? She doesn't say quite what she means with sorrow there. I suspect she's referring back to the Philomena story. Say, hast thou felt from friends some cruel wrong? So have your friends betrayed you, or diest thou? Are you dying, a martyr of disastrous love? Are you dying because love has hurt you so bad? But she situates the nightingale as female. Ah, songstress sad, that such my lot might be. So she's saying you are a female. I think she can kind of just instinctively decides that the nightingale is female. She's wrong, sadly, just as a minor point. Female nightingales don't sing. That was not widely known at the time, because there weren't such, people didn't know that much about birds. They didn't have cameras and stuff. Only the male nightingales sing. But anyway, she didn't know that, so forget that. Forget that fact until you go to a tomb. Songstress sad, that such my lot might be, to sigh and sing at liberty like thee. And I think that is really interesting, because what she's asking for is absolutely what she's got. She's miserable. We know this from the other poem. She's suffering. And then what she asks at that point is to be able to sing. Now, remember, this is Smith's first publication, the Elegiac Sonnets. This is the moment when she kind of basically is allowed to sing. This is where she gets to say, okay, this is my woe. I'm gonna leave the nest at night and sing. Many years after this, well, not that many, but 30 years after this, Percy Shelley writes The Defense of Poetry, which we will talk about later. It has many very famous lines about poetry, and one of the famous ones is he says, a poet is like a nightingale. I'm going to mess up the quote slightly, but basically sings to cheer its own heart, to cheer its solitude. To cheer its own heart with sweet sounds. So he's essentially sort of saying there that all a poet is doing is singing to himself. He's trying to make sense of the sadness and the misery by making a song. And I'm sure he's drawing on Smith there, whether directly or indirectly through sort of seeing someone else. But it's very similar to this sort of poem. So the sonnets, I think, are much more accessible simply by being nice and short and very pretty. Immensely popular works. I'm just trying to have a look what I want to see. Is there anything else there? No, there are more. There are more examples on the actual slides. I've just picked out a couple of lines that I thought were useful and nice. Use those as you will. So do we like it at the end? As we finish up, are we inspired to read more of Smith? Do we think, oh, we like it, or are we kind of just like, sure, I'm fine, I got through it? Yeah, bit of the latter. Give me some thoughts, give me some verdicts.
I really like her stuff, especially like knowing, especially like what was the sonnet in the video? That one I really like that, especially knowing the like background behind it and her own like problems and stuff. And I think it's just so beautiful, especially that she doesn't directly put herself in it either. It's just but like if you didn't know, like you wouldn't know. But yeah, I think her writing's really beautiful, and I do like The Immigrants. When I first read it, I was really confused, but after going through it like each bit, it makes so much more sense. It just is very, very good.
Good. I'm really glad. Yeah, I mean, like, for those of you who haven't yet watched the video, do particularly for the little extract of well, the extract, the sonnet, lines written on the seashore, because I think it's one of the most romantic poems and a really significant early romantic poem. So read that, have a little watch of the video. I think that's a really important one and a really, really beautiful one. And I guess the whole kind of her not sharing why it's happening, I think that kind of ties in nicely what we were just saying about the nightingale, where she's sort of sitting there going, I don't know why this nightingale is sad. Similarly, she never quite says in her poems, this is what's happened to me, but she's just kind of, she's singing, she's pouring out her songs, and the feeling is there, even if we don't know the exact reason for it. So The Immigrants is something very different because it is so political. It's her directly engaging in political issues and writing with a purpose to get people's attention, to say, hey, look, listen, you need to be thinking about this, you need to be taking care of it. Any final questions or anything on this or any other element of what we're doing? I'm just going to double check that next week, and in my head yes, it's lyrical ballads next week. That will be a lot of fun. I think will be very significant. One of the kind of the absolute classics of romantic study. You can't do romanticism and not do the lyrical ballads. Those are written by Wordsworth and Coleridge together. It's mostly Wordsworth, but Coleridge is in on it the whole time. It's a collaborative project. So the required reading there is Lines Written in Early Spring and the preface to Lyrical Ballads. We will go through the preface to Lyrical Ballads in the class particularly, but you definitely need to have read the whole thing by some point to really fully understand it. And there's just a nice little one I've put in there as well. There Was a Boy, which is, yeah, you've got the page reference. It doesn't really have a proper title, so what it's called. There was a boy, you knew him well. There's some further reading as well. Have a look at whatever you want. I have put The Rime of the Ancient Mariner on further reading. You are going to need to read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner over the course of this module. There's a couple of different classes where I'm going to touch on it. So it's required reading for Coleridge, but it's probably going to be useful to kind of get a little bit ahead on that. There's lots of further reading there. You can have a little look at them. Michael is quite a long poem. It's quite dense, but it gives you, I think if you're going to write on Wordsworth, you can get into that. Lines Written Near Richmond upon Thames, I think a sonnet, and it's about Richmond. So I was just like, oh, that's nice. It's just a little snippet and a nice thing to read. And then I put in another Coleridge poem there as well, just for context, should you like. Yeah, so I will have a video and I will have that up by Thursday at the latest, just to give you a little introduction to those guys. And yeah, I will see you guys next week if there's nothing else. Fairly well then, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.